December 1944. Replacement depot, Normandy, France. A veteran Sherman tank crew stood before their commanding officer. They had survived 6 months of combat. They had earned 2 Bronze Stars between them. Now, they refused their assignment. The officer was incredulous. These were experienced men, battle-tested. They were being offered a perfectly functional M4 Sherman tank. But the crew wouldn't budge. They would accept disciplinary action, court-martial if necessary. They would not crew that specific model of Sherman tank. This wasn't an isolated incident. Across the European theater in late 1944, experienced tank crews were refusing certain Sherman models. Not all Shermans, just specific variants. To their commanders, it seemed like insubordination. The U.S. Army had produced over 49,000 Sherman tanks by this point in the war. They were reliable. They had helped win North Africa and Sicily. They had broken out of Normandy. But the crews knew something their commanders were only beginning to understand from statistical reports. The early model M4 Sherman, with the gasoline engine and dry ammunition storage, had a catastrophic flaw. A flaw that turned a survivable hit into a death sentence. This is the story of how American tank crews discovered this flaw through brutal experience, how they tried to warn the Army, and how their refusals, documented in maintenance logs and after-action reports, eventually saved thousands of lives. The Sherman's deadly secret was about to be exposed. July 1944. Maintenance records from the 3rd Armored Division, held at the National Archives, tell the story in cold numbers. Of 232 Sherman tanks knocked out in combat during June and July, 187 had burned completely. That's 80%. The official casualty reports are more disturbing. When a Sherman was penetrated by enemy fire, the crew had an average of 30 seconds to evacuate before ammunition ignition. In many cases, they had less. Staff Sergeant Lafayette Poole, commander of the 3rd Armored Division's most successful tank, described the phenomenon in his October 1944 debriefing, archived at Fort Knox. When an 88 hits the Sherman, you've got maybe 20 seconds if you're lucky. The ammo goes up like a Roman candle. We called them Ronsons after the lighter. Lights first time, every time. The German tankers had noticed too. Interrogation reports from the 12th SS Panzer Division, captured in August 1944, revealed they had a different name for American Shermans: Tommy Cookers. The problem was mechanical and obvious once you understood it. The early M4 Sherman stored its 75mm ammunition in racks along the interior hull. The rounds were unprotected. The fuel tanks used standard gasoline, not diesel. When an armor-piercing round penetrated the hull, it often struck ammunition or fuel lines. The resulting fire was instantaneous and catastrophic. By contrast, ordnance reports noted that the later model Sherman M4 A3E8, equipped with wet ammunition storage ammunition racks surrounded by water glycerin jackets, had a burn rate of only 15% when hit. That's an 80% reduction in fire deaths. Same tank, different ammunition storage. But in late 1944, thousands of the older, unmodified Shermans were still in frontline service. And experienced crews who had seen too many friends burned to death were refusing to crew them. The Sherman's vulnerability wasn't an accident. It was a calculated compromise. Declassified Ordnance Department memoranda from 1941, available at the National Archives, reveal the thinking behind early Sherman design. American tank doctrine prioritized reliability, speed, and production volume over maximum armor protection. The M4 Sherman was designed to be shipped across the Atlantic, landed on hostile beaches, and maintained by relatively inexperienced crews. It needed a power-to-weight ratio that allowed it to travel long distances on roads that were often damaged or primitive. The Army Ordnance Department chose the Wright R975 radial gasoline engine for early models because it was readily available, reliable, and provided adequate power. The decision is documented in a February 1941 engineering assessment. The gasoline engine provides optimal power-to-weight characteristics for the M4's intended operational profile. No one anticipated the consequences when facing German 88mm anti-tank guns at close range. The ammunition storage was similarly optimized for access and loading speed. Ordnance specification documents show that shells were stored along the hull sides and floor for rapid crew access during sustained fire missions. Water jackets around ammunition, which would later prove life-saving, added weight and complexity. In 1941, they seemed unnecessary. American planners expected tank versus tank combat to be relatively rare. They were wrong. The first documented Sherman fires occurred during Operation Torch in November 1942. After-action reports from the 1st Armored Division, held at Fort Knox, describe multiple incidents of catastrophic ammunition fires following relatively minor penetrations. But North Africa didn't reveal the full extent of the problem. German armor in Tunisia was often older Panzer III and Panzer IV models. Combat ranges were frequently long, across open desert. Crews had time to evacuate when hit. Lieutenant Colonel Louis V. Hightower, commanding a tank battalion in the 1st Armored Division, filed a report in March 1943 noting, "Ammunition fires following penetration are occurring at higher than anticipated rates. Recommend investigation into protective measures." The Ordnance Department acknowledged the report. They initiated a study, but modifications to existing tanks would require pulling vehicles from the production line and retrofitting thousands of units already in service. The cost in time and resources seemed prohibitive. The war was accelerating. Shermans were needed immediately in Sicily, then Italy, then for the coming invasion of France. The report was filed. Production continued unchanged. June 1944. The bocage country of Normandy turned the Sherman's vulnerability into a death sentence. The hedgerows of Normandy consisted of dense vegetation growing from earthen banks 4 to 6 feet high. They created a maze of small fields and narrow lanes. Visibility was measured in yards, not hundreds of yards. This meant German anti-tank guns, primarily the 75mm PaK-40 and 88mm PaK-43, could engage American armor at point-blank range, often from ambush positions. Combat records from the 2nd Armored Division document the carnage. During the first 3 weeks of July 1944, the division lost 133 Sherman tanks. Of these, 98 burned completely following initial penetration. Crew casualties were catastrophic. Sergeant Elmer Joe Chaffin, a tank commander with the 2nd Armored, described the horror in his August 1944 letter home, later donated to the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center. When you get hit, you have maybe 20 seconds before the whole thing goes up. Some guys can get out. Usually the driver and co-driver are trapped. You hear them screaming. There's nothing you can do. The psychological impact on replacement crews was severe. Tank company commanders began reporting morale problems. New crews, hearing stories from survivors, were terrified before they ever saw combat. Colonel Sidney R. Hines, commanding Combat Command B of the 2nd Armored Division, documented the crisis in a July 29, 1944 report. Crew confidence in the M4 is deteriorating. Replacements are requesting transfer to infantry before entering combat. This is unprecedented and unacceptable. But the most significant response came from the crews themselves. They began modifying their tanks. Maintenance logs from multiple armored divisions reveal an explosion of unauthorized field modifications in July and August 1944. Crews welded additional armor plates to their Sherman's hulls. They scavenged armor from destroyed German vehicles. They filled sandbags and strapped them to vulnerable points. Some crews acquired concrete and poured it into spaces between the original armor and interior wall. The 3rd Armored Division's maintenance officer, Captain James Bates, documented these modifications in an August 12, 1944, memorandum. Approximately 60% of tanks in this division now carry unauthorized armor additions. Weight has increased by an estimated 2 to 3 tons per vehicle. This affects suspension, speed, and mechanical reliability. However, crews refuse to remove modifications. The most telling modification involved ammunition. Crews began reducing their ammunition load from the standard 90 rounds to as few as 50 rounds. They removed shells from the vulnerable hull racks and carried them only in the turret basket or stored them outside the tank entirely. Lieutenant Colonel William Hamburg, operations officer for the 4th Armored Division, noted in his September 1944 report, "Tank commanders are trading firepower for survival. They know that fewer rounds in the tank mean fewer rounds to cook off when penetrated. This is a rational response to an impossible situation, but modifications could only do so much. The fundamental problem remained: gasoline engines and unprotected ammunition." The first documented refusal occurred on August 3, 1944. Maintenance records from the 743rd Tank Battalion show that Sergeant Raymond Mitchell and his crew declined a replacement M4 Sherman with the standard dry ammunition storage. The battalion maintenance log records the incident. SGT Mitchell's crew refused assigned vehicle. Crew states, "We won't crew a Ronson," awaiting command decision. Mitchell's commander faced a dilemma. The sergeant and his crew were experienced. They had fought through Normandy for 6 weeks. They weren't cowards or malingerers. After consultation with division headquarters, a compromise was reached. Mitchell's crew received an M4A3 Sherman that had just arrived from the United States with the newer wet ammunition storage system. The precedent was set. By September 1944, refusals were occurring across multiple armored divisions. The pattern was consistent: experienced crews, often with commendations, refusing older model Shermans while accepting newer variants. The Army's response was documented in a September 18, 1944, memo from 1st Army Headquarters. Tank crew refusals of assigned vehicles represent a growing morale and disciplinary problem. Commanders are instructed to educate crews on the necessity of accepting all available equipment. However, where newer model vehicles are available, assignment of same to experienced crews is authorized at commander's discretion. In effect, the Army was tacitly acknowledging the crews were right. Lieutenant Harold Fulton, a platoon leader in the 6th Armored Division, described the situation in his October 1944 diary, now held at the Library of Congress. "The men aren't being unreasonable. They've seen what happens. Command knows it too. Nobody wants to order a man into a death trap when there's a safer alternative sitting right there in the motor pool." By October 1944, the data was irrefutable. An Ordnance Department study completed in November 1944, declassified in 1974, compiled casualty data from all armored divisions in the European theater. The findings were stark. M4 and M4A1 Shermans with dry ammunition storage, 60 to 80% burn rate when penetrated. Average crew survival, 2.1 members out of 5. The report concluded, wet ammunition storage represents the single most significant survivability improvement implemented during the current conflict. Priority conversion of existing vehicles is recommended. But conversion wasn't simple. Retrofitting wet storage required extensive hull modification. Each tank needed approximately 80 hours of depot-level maintenance. With thousands of Shermans in service, the logistics were staggering. The solution was to accelerate production of newer models while gradually retiring older variants to secondary roles. By January 1945, the majority of new Shermans reaching Europe featured wet storage as standard equipment. But that meant older model tanks remained in service throughout late 1944 and into early 1945, and experienced crews continued refusing them. General Omar Bradley addressed the issue in his December 1944 staff conference, documented in 1st Army Group records. Our tank crews are voting with their feet on the Sherman design. We need to listen to that vote. By January 1945, official policy had shifted. A directive from SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, dated January 8, 1945, stated, "Commanders are authorized to prioritize assignment of newer model M4A3 tanks with wet ammunition storage to experienced crews. Older model vehicles shall be assigned to reserve units or utilized in secondary roles where combat probability is reduced." This represented a complete reversal from September's position. The Army was now officially acknowledging what crews had known for months. Some Sherman models were more dangerous than others. The German surrender in May 1945 prevented full implementation of the policy, but the lessons were learned. Post-war tank design would prioritize crew survivability alongside firepower and mobility. No tank crew was court-martialed for refusing an older model Sherman. Command recognized the refusals were based on legitimate safety concerns, not cowardice or insubordination. Sergeant Raymond Mitchell, whose August 1944 refusal was the first documented case, survived the war. He was awarded the Silver Star in March 1945 for actions during the Rhine crossing. His after-action report noted he was commanding an M4A3 with wet ammunition storage. Staff Sergeant Lafayette Poole, who coined the nickname Ronson for the burning Shermans, became the most successful American tank commander of the war. He was credited with destroying 258 enemy vehicles before he was finally wounded in September 1944. He survived. His crew survived. They were in a late-model Sherman with wet storage. The crews who refused weren't being difficult. They were being smart. And their refusals forced the Army to confront an engineering flaw that was killing American soldiers. The Sherman tank fought from North Africa to Germany. It served in every theater of World War II. Over 49,000 were produced. It was reliable, mechanically sound, and available in numbers that overwhelmed German production. But between 1942 and late 1944, thousands of American tank crewmen died in fires that were preventable. The solution existed. Wet ammunition storage surrounding ammunition racks with water glycerin jackets reduced the burn rate from 80% to 15%. The modification added approximately 400 pounds to the tank's weight. It reduced internal storage space slightly. It saved lives. Post-war analysis by the Army's Armored Board, published in 1946, estimated that wet ammunition storage prevented between 2,000 and 3,000 crew deaths in the final year of the European War. The tank crews who refused older model Shermans weren't heroes. They didn't receive medals for their refusals. Many didn't even consider their actions particularly brave. But they forced institutional change through collective action. Their refusals, documented in maintenance logs across multiple divisions, created data that commanders couldn't ignore. When experienced crewsmen with Bronze Stars and months of combat refused specific equipment, that refusal carried weight. The lesson extended beyond World War II. Modern U.S. military doctrine acknowledges the principle that equipment safety concerns raised by experienced personnel must be investigated and addressed. The modern Army's safety reporting system, which allows soldiers to report equipment deficiencies without fear of reprisal, has its roots in the Sherman controversy. Today, the M4A3 Sherman with wet ammunition storage is preserved at multiple military museums. The placard at the National Armor and Cavalry Museum at Fort Moore includes a single line about ammunition storage. Late-model Shermans incorporated wet ammunition stowage, significantly improving crew survivability. That single line represents thousands of lives. The men who refused to crew the older Shermans understood something fundamental. Following orders is essential, but blind obedience to equipment that kills you is not duty. It's suicide. They drew a line. They said, "We'll fight, but not in that tank. Give us one that gives us a chance." The Army listened, eventually, and because they listened, thousands of American tank crewmen came home who otherwise would have burned to death in a French hedgerow or a German field. The Sherman was never perfect, but by 1945, it was survivable. That was enough.